I'm Sailor Moon. And I'm Sailor Venus. And today we're going to talk about why we don't do anything when it comes to ownership or fair work. Now, you might think, oh, why would we be talking about this for? Why would this be something we need to talk about? Well, there's a lot of folks in this world that would probably think that would wonder why we never do anything when it comes to ownership or fair work. Now, true, there is a thing called fair work, and even if you do everything you have to do to shift that work into something that it was never meant to be, or you could still get in a bind with ownership, which there are a lot of times where, oh, no, I just stop talking about that because I don't know anything about that. And knowing me, I don't know nothing about that. So, the true film of this film is that this might just have been a follow-up from the last film. And the first thing we want to say is, we want to say how sad we are for Sailor Jupiter being way in the back and me being in front. Well, that's not what I meant to do in the film, but sadly, that's the free likenesses that YouTube picked, and I can't hold two dolls. Two dolls we both cannot be up at the same time when the shooter's going off taking a likeness. So shooting a likeness, so it is what it is. But anyway, so a lot of folks still have this belief that Toonmakers Sailor Moon was SABAN Moon, but the truth was SABAN really didn't have anything to do with it for maybe backing and affording it. And that was it. The actual work was going to be done by Toonmakers, which they were going, and let's be earnest about it. Toonmakers was going to do Sailor Moon, and they were going to do it between a live show and a drawing show. And that would be worth a lot. Even probably more than SABAN at the time was in a deal to back and afford. So that's why Toei went with Deke. And someone said it was 1993, but that was not true. 1994, I believe, was when the bid war happened. Or maybe it was early 1995 when the bid war happened between Deke and Toonmakers with their forwarder and backer, SABAN. Now, around this time, now a lot of folks would bitch and say, well, Deke didn't really took a lot of freedoms. Yes, they did. Deke did take a lot of freedoms with Sailor Moon. Freedoms that they had the right to take under the deal they had with Toei. Toonmakers, it wasn't that they didn't lose the deal, as I said, out of not following what was told. They lost the deal because it would be way too much work for both sides. Too much work for Toonmakers to do all the filming for the live thing, the live show, and all the drawing for the drawing show. And that was why SABAN was out and Toonmakers was out. And there really isn't really that much, out there of it. Yes, there are some drawings that still live somewhere on the interweb and some folks own. But at the end of the day, much of it's not really there. Now, what I know from it is that Luna was still in it, but she was white. That was a big unlike. There was no Artemis. He was not even anywhere in there. Yes, there was Queen Beryl. She was still in it. Tuxedo Mask was still in it, but unlike the Deke and the Pioneer and even the Viz takes, was mostly just the English work of the Toei take, Um, she would behave like she wouldn't tell anyone he was back, and she wouldn't tell anyone that he lived. Unlike all the other ones where I didn't know that it was Tuxedo Mask, I didn't know it was him, and the Toonmakers one, I know. And always keep in mind that in the Toonmakers one, my name would have been, oh yeah, no, Rebecca. But they keep calling her Sailor Moon. Do they mean Queenling Serenity? Now, I'm not going to get through with the shifting of the names, because they did shift the names on that, or how they were drawn. But at the end of the day, at the end of the day, folks would have seek something about that one I didn't like. Sure. Right, Sailor Moon. And one of the first misunderstandings of it is that it was never a Siobhan Moon. Even though, yes, Siobhan was the backer and the forwarder of Toonmakers, if Toonmakers would win the right to do Sailor Moon. But it was Toonmakers Moon. Toonmakers would have been the one, if everything would have worked out, to do their take on Sailor Moon. And that would have been the one that everyone would have saw, instead of seeing the Toei one that would eventually that would, instead of seeing the Toei one that Deke and Pioneer would have gotten the rights to run. That one would never seen the air of day. And those folks that bitched about the Deke take and the Pioneer take would have been bitching about the Toonmakers take. But let's be earnest about it, it was Toonmakers that did it, and it was not Siobhan. Even though a lot of folks out there still call it that. You know. So, yes, Siobhan was in it, but only as a forwarder and backer of Toonmakers for the working of Sailor Moon, but they were not be doing Sailor Moon themselves. Now, would this one ever see the air of day? Probably not, since Sailor Moon is owned between Nako Takaguchi and Toei, and since they own all ownership over all the takes of Sailor Moon, including the ones that were, including the deals that Deke and Pioneer had back in the day, that would also include the Toonmakers deal. And it also includes Viz just having a right to do the English work only. So probably not. That one is probably owned by them as well. Even though it never really did get made, except for a little upcoming film that Toonmakers made that they were going to show that they were going to show to them, to the folkworks that wanted to pick up the show. Now, the song. And keep in mind, Sailor Moon, a lot of folks seem to think that your Deke song was the name known one. Would you mind see the song that came out of Toonmakers one? Because that one was out there. Yeah. The only really big unlikeness was that, yeah. So, at the end of the day, thank you, Sailor Venus. So, at the end of the day, Toonmaker's Moon was not. It was Toonmaker's Moon, not Siobhan's Moon. And the only thing that Siobhan had to do in it was the affording and backing of Toonmakers if they would have won the right to do the show. But it was worth way too much for them to do a live show and to do a drawing show. So at the end of the day, that's why Toonmakers was out. And that's why Deke ended up winning the first two followings, which would eventually led to Pioneer winning the two other followings and the 3 films years later. Keep in mind it was Siobhan once again that Pioneer was fighting around 1999 for the other 2 followings of Sailor Moon and the 3 films. And Siobhan did not win this one, didn't win the rights to that. That won over to Pioneer for the third and fourth followings, as well as the free films. Um, but at the end of the day, there were little misunderstandings. Now, yeah, before I go, we had these starships, I guess you could say, Star Riders, which yes, Irwin or Bandai did bring in to as toys, but they were never on the show. They were going to be in a Toonmakers one, but not on the Deke one or the Pioneer one, or you know. So that's it. I'm Sailor Moon and I'm Sailor Venus. Hope you like this film. Serena Mina out.